You're in the right place. This is the Eatfluencer Podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Maggie Landes. Together, we are going to unpack everything about eating and discover the what, when, and how that will let you lead your best life. This is not your doctor's conversation about nutrition. Today is when you can start to love eating again. Let food be food and you be you. Get ready to get eatfluenced. Hi there. Welcome to the Eatfluencer Podcast again. I'm Maggie Landes, your host. And if you're a return listener, I am so grateful that you're here. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, just a brief intro. I am a board-certified physician, public health nutritionist, and an anti-diet health coach who helps particularly women who are exasperated with chronic dieting find ways to fix their food overwhelm and have a higher quality, healthful life through an undieted approach to their eating. It's a lot of mindset work. It's really a fun transformation to work through when I see women sort of be able to reclaim their relationship with food and just get out of their own way and do what they're meant to do in life, which is not spend all their time dieting. Anyhow, this is episode 16, the problem with BMI. So, BMI, body mass index. I know you've heard it. That's a term, a metric that I'm sure you have heard from your doctor, your healthcare team, or if you've ever worked with a registered dietitian, a sports nutritionist, and if they're practicing in the traditional way that they were trained and that our culture supports their practice, they probably really put a heavy hand on BMI and have you believing that that's a extremely important measurement for your health. Well, what we're going to unpack today on this episode is where this is problematic and how this really falls apart. We're going to talk a little bit about the origin of the actual measurement of BMI and how over time that has been completely blown out of proportion and taken out of its original context and really become this essentially weapon. I hate to use that word, but really the weapon for the diet industry and the healthcare sector to beat consumers into buying their products, falling into their line of thought, and really just sort of mass producing this idea that heavy is bad and thin is better, and we should be willing to sacrifice it all to achieve those weight-centric goals. We're going to talk very briefly about weight stigma in our healthcare system and how that's actually worsening health outcomes for many people, but that's a huge conversation that we need to really dedicate more time specifically to, and you can look forward to that in the future. I already have that planned out, but we are going to introduce the concept of HAES, or health at every size. That's HAES. You've probably seen that in some places, hopefully, but this is really the correct belief that there is health at every size of body. And we're going to talk about how you can be more evolved than your own healthcare team and sort of advocate for what is truly evidence-based. So we got to get into the evidence here. This is going to be a little bit of a history lesson, which, if anybody knows me, that is very strange coming from me because history is not my forte. Out of all the games of Trivial Pursuit I played, I don't think I've ever gotten the yellow little pie piece, because that was the history section. But anyway, we have to talk about this because you have to understand where this came from to see how, frankly, asinine our use of BMI is today. It'll all make sense by the time we get to the end, but stick with me. There's some details that are important in this history lesson. So, first of all, you have to understand that the term BMI is, new-ish, and we'll get to where that came from. But the formula, which is essentially your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared, that's how you calculate BMI. It's a measurement, and the units of the measurement are kilograms per meter squared. That measurement, that formula, was developed in the early 19th century. Honestly, I think it was in the 1830s, by this Belgian mathematician named Adolphe Quetelet, I think is how you say it. I don't know. My French is not fantastic, but he was a statistician, a mathematician. He's not a doctor. He was not a clinical, person that really had any interest in health or medicine. He was a statistician, and he was studying the distribution of sizes of people in a whole population and doing some statistical modeling of it. Okay, that was his goal, is to basically look at large groups of people and see if the sizes of the people, when they were all graphed out, fell into a normal distribution or a normal bell curve type thing. So his variable only worked and met that hypothesis, having a normal distribution, if he squared the height. Just measuring weights alone didn't seem to fulfill his hypothesis. He couldn't even just use weight by height. That wasn't a normal distribution. So he created a formula, weight over height squared, in order to fit his data, which was mathematical, statistical population data, into a graph. Okay, he was studying population. This is really important, is that he was studying a population. He's not studying individual people, because he wasn't a person interested in that he wasn't a doctor or any version of 19th century healthcare provider. Okay, so interestingly, he was, like I said, he was Belgian. These were almost all the people in the population that he was studying in his studies, where he came up with this formula, were white, Western European men. So that, even just knowing that, you can already see how the relevance of BMI to us now is falling apart. So we have a formula that is created by a early 19th century mathematician as a population statistic for Western European white men. Okay, so if that sits a little strange to you, it should, because that's not at all how we interpret that BMI measurement to be. But we need to know what was going on culturally at that time too, okay? So, the early mid 19th century, even into the late 19th century, fatness and larger bodies, curvy bodies, was actually preferred. It had been preferred for centuries. We know, hundreds of years before that, from artists that depicted, sort of social norms of the time, and from writings that were done then. It was actually a privilege or an advantage to have a larger body. That represented abundance and health and wealth. You had a lifestyle of plenty. Those were the people that were in power, that were revered by the culture. Thinness was a marker of scarcity and poverty and illness, and many of the causes of death at that time were related to infectious diseases. And so when you were chronically ill with an infection, there was this wasting phenomena that happened, and thin people were sometimes very unhealthy. And that was sort of the MO of interpreting thinness, was unhealth. So, the mathematician that came up with this formula was not doing it to ostracize or single out large bodies, because if anything, in his culture at the time, large bodies were actually favorable. Okay. And then around the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 1900s, the turn of the century, there was this change in the United States where we moved to a perspective where obesity, and I say obesity in quotes because there wasn't really obesity, that's like an arbitrary term, but fatness and large bodies were a marker of sort of moral failure. This is during the second kind of industrial revolution, and it was expected that people, working in society in the urban centers, doing what they were supposed to be doing, did not get fat, and that fatness was a sort of failure of self-control or ambition. It sort of signified, bad habits or low moral character, and that was the beginning of fat phobia and weight stigma. All right. Plus, there was some certainly immigrant groups coming to the United States that had larger body types, and singling them out in this way was a manner that they could be sort of set apart from the crowd. But just remember, at this time, so BMI was not a thing. It wasn't there was no thing. This mathematical formula that the Belgian guy 100 years before that came up with was just for this sort of statistical study of his, and then it was kind of just faded out into the background of mathematical literature. It wasn't a thing. In fact, at the time, the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 1900s, it wasn't even really normative to even know your weight. It wasn't done in medical practice routinely at all, and it was absolutely not done in the home as just something that you do is weigh yourself. Spring, platform scales that are the easiest way to weigh a human without having some huge contraption with counterbalances and all this kind of stuff. They had only been recently produced. I don't know exactly when they were invented, but that was like the late 19th century that those were even devices that were available. And the first places that they showed up were at carnivals and sort of exhibitions where it was a novelty to weigh a human like easily. Like they could stand on a little platform and there was a spring scale and a little gauge and it went up and told you their weight. So it was almost entertainment to see this. It wasn't something that average people in the early 1900s could access or measure on themselves or even know about themselves. So here's where this goes. So, the early 20th century, there were a lot of advances, medical advances and treatment of infectious diseases and all these sorts of things where life expectancy started creeping up. That was good. Our public health, our sanitation, everything else was improving. People were living, potentially into their 50s now. And what we noticed at the time was that more people were dying of heart disease, stroke, other things that were not infectious. And they weren't all identified. They didn't have the diagnostic armamentarium that we have now, obviously. But it was obvious that people were dying of things that were not infections. So, who cares about that, right? Well, I'll tell you who cares about that is life insurance companies, because they have to pay if you're insured and you die. So there was a big push in, let's say, the 1920s, 1930s, to gather actuarial data to try to predict when these people were going to die so that they could, the insurance company could judge their their rates and have a sort of risk assessment tool so that they don't get totally, racketeered by people dying when they had to pay out money. So all money related. All right. And so there were some big studies that were done at that time where they took retrospective data from, 30 or 40 years time between like the 1880s and the 1920s to figure out what was a predictor of death. They look at all these people and say, what variable or what factor appears to correlate with death, because we need to charge those people more money. What they found in this, and I'm talking, like I said, this is the 1920s, 1930s, that there appeared to be a correlation that heavier people had higher rates of death from presumptively heart disease. Now, the thing that's important to remember that I have repeated many, many times is that correlation is not causation. And that is the most dangerous fallacy when interpreting science, is that correlation just means that two things are occurring at the same time. It does not mean that one thing causes the other. All right. And that's important to understand. I give the example. My example is basically like in the summertime, there's an increase in ice cream sales and there's an increase in home burglaries. All right. So those two things are correlated. If you charted them, it would look like ice cream sales are correlated with home burglaries, but it has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the fact that in the summer it's hot, people leave their windows open, and so their homes get burglarized, and it's hot, and people buy ice cream. They're not actually causative. They're just correlated. So that's the same dangerous interpretation when you apply that to science, data, that it's a whole different method to prove that something is causative. You have to do a intentional, really randomized study with controlled variables and all these sorts of things. So epidemiologic studies do not prove causation. Get back to what we're talking about. So they have all this data. They make a correlative assumption that being heavier causes death from heart disease. So the public health, statisticians, insurance companies, the entire culture took that information and just totally ran with it. And honestly, this was the first time in the 1920s, 1930s that the promotion of weight loss as a health, promoting behavior was even introduced. And the entire diet industry was born. I mean, almost just instantaneously, the public wants to do the things they're being told to do, which is lose weight so you don't die. And all of a sudden there's pills and creams and devices and contraptions and procedures where they were going in and burning parts of people's brains, trying to figure out where their appetite came from, all this sort of crazy, crazy stuff. But that was basically the birth of the diet industry. So we're going to keep going through our timeline here. All right. So it gets to be like the 1940s. There was sort of a world war that got everybody distracted for a little bit, and nobody really talked about this too much in that interim period. Well, then what happened in the late 1940s is the initiation of the Framingham study. And if you're not familiar with the Framingham study, this is actually like one of the coolest cohort studies ever designed, because it was started in 1948. The original cohort was collected in 1948, and this study is still ongoing. They're now on the, third or fourth generation of offspring data, and they have studied a variety of things over time with this large cohort. But what they were originally trying to do was look for risk factors for cardiac disease. That's why the study was set up, was to look for risk factors for cardiac disease, because cardiac disease was a major killer and we wanted to figure out why so we could prevent it, right? Well, interestingly, the long-term results of this study, and even the short-term results that they had available to them after that first cohort, was that people in the, quote, normal weight, and of course I said normal weight was made up. I mean, it was made up based on the statistical modeling of this guy from Belgium and his math model. There's nothing normal. When they say normal, it's like normal in a math term, like the middle of the bell curve normal. The fact that normal weight is X number of pounds that's totally irrelevant. Does that kind of make sense, hopefully? So, but the Framingham data shows that normal weight people and, quote, overweight people have actually the same risk of cardiac disease and death. And that the things that increase risk for cardiac disease and dying is, get this, being underweight, weight cycling, so, large and repetitive gains and losses in weight, intentional weight loss efforts. Interesting, right? That the data really shows that weight stability is one of the best protective factors. So what that means is, what I'm saying is that not having your weight yo-yo back and forth and go up, down, up, down, up, down is worse. That's worse than just being, quote, overweight and staying there. And that's, that's been shown in several studies since Framingham. That's just, Framingham is a real solid, large cohort that kind of shows that. But the other thing, too, is that the Framingham data shows that improvements in diet quality, and I say diet, not like diet culture, but eating, nutrition quality, and the implementation of exercise and movement are, basically protective factors for cardiac disease independent of weight loss. So that means if you keep your weight stable, incorporate a higher quality nutrition and physical movement plan, it has nothing to do with what your weight is. Okay? Weight loss is not required for health. And the Framingham data basically, started to prove that point in the 1940s, 1950s. Okay, interesting how we got to where we are now, right? Okay, we're in the 1950s now. I cannot continue without mentioning Ancel Keys, because he's the one that really, brought this BMI formula to the evolution that it is now. But Ancel Keys was a physiologist, and in a nutshell, he had a hypothesis that fat causes heart disease. And he went to great lengths throughout his career to basically prove that. I mean, he was the OG in terms of fat phobia. And he had personal values and an ingrained bias that really affected his ability to perform unbiased, clean research. And he really devoted all means at his disposal, including these surreptitious research methods, to prove that, eating fat makes you fat, and being fat makes you have heart disease and be dead. That's the nutshell bio on Ancel Keys. And you may know him from, he was the one that conducted the very famous Minnesota starvation study, which I'm not going to talk about here. But if you ever want scientific proof of what restrictive eating does to a human, that's the study you need to go read. But essentially his entire career hinged on this proving that eating fat makes you fat, being fat causes heart disease. And there was so much bad science in this. He was privately funded from the sugar industry. He had a famous 7 countries study, which if you actually read the origin of that, he had studied data in 22 countries, but he trimmed off the other 15 that didn't fit his hypothesis. And you don't do that in research. I mean, basically, all his research was focused on measures of fatness. And like I said, proving that being fat, eating fat makes you fat, and being fat makes you dead. So you have to remember, okay, we're back in the 1950s. So the way that, quote, fatness was measured, or adiposity or obesity, whatever word you want to use, they had skin fold calipers. They had these very elaborate water or air displacement, plasmography machines, and everything was very invasive, inconvenient, expensive, not really practical, kind of depends on operator error and all these sorts of things. And so he, to conduct all these studies, needed to come up with something where he could measure, quote, fatness, that was something easy that he could apply to all his, data points without all the subjects, without all this other measurement complexity. So enter the, at that time, 120-year-old math formula from this Belgian mathematician, the BMI. Well, BMI, we already talked about, was designed by a mathematician in an epidemiologic context to measure a population. And we can argue whether or not that was even useful, based on the way he came up with the formula. But let's just say it is. It was never, ever intended to be used in a clinical application to individual people, to individual humans. And, besides that fact, we know now, and you probably even know now, that BMI is a terrible measure of, fatness or body fat mass. I mean, Keyes himself, conceded that essentially there is complications when the body composition changes. And, the best example is like a very muscular athlete may have a very high BMI because their weight for height is high because muscle is very dense, but they probably have a very low body fat percentage, probably, are, it just doesn't correlate. All right. So, it doesn't work. It doesn't work with children because growth periods, body composition changes during growth periods. It doesn't really work for, people that have chronic medical conditions. It just doesn't work. I mean, the bottom line doesn't just work, but Keyes himself, wanted to use this to prove his hypothesis. Well, we've got a lot of studies. Even Keyes himself had studies where there was a U distribution. So like the capital letter U, if you imagine that, all right, that the highest death or mortality or badness was at both ends of extremes, not just the extreme end with people that are really fat or heavy. The underweight people had outcomes as bad as the overweight people. So, and that was from him himself, although that wasn't the results he advertised widely. But if you're not completely convinced yet that this is a bogus, arbitrary mathematical calculation completely applied outside of any context for which it was originally designed, I mean, that's it. BMI means nothing for an individual. It is literally a social construct that an extremely controversial scientist from 70 years ago manipulated into a position to try and simplify his research. That's the summary. Now, it's sad to say, but honestly, even scientists are sometimes very poor consumers of science. And our entire healthcare system, the food industry, the diet industry, all this, quote, science has just used BMI and taken that mathematical calculation and ran with it and applied it in every possible context, never scrutinizing the validity of it or where it originated from. And all you hear now is BMI. BMI is important. Intentional weight loss is desirable. We have a ideal body weight. You have to get there at all costs. Eating fat will make you fat. Fat is bad. Being overweight will kill you. You know the messaging. And I don't hold you responsible for falling for it. I mean, if the medical community and the public health academicians and the nutrition scientists and all that sort of stuff, all those people that are supposed to be scientists can't distinguish good and bad evidence, I certainly don't expect a regular layperson to even be aware of that. But here's what I'm telling you. BMI is worthless. That is the evidence-based truth, and I hope that you've heard that through this conversation today. I am sorry that you're being badgered and stigmatized from your medical providers. I'm sorry that you're being bullied by the diet industry. I'm sorry you're being completely swindled and taken by the food industry. And I'm sorry you're being penalized. Socially, you're being penalized financially by your insurance company. But I'm telling you, the scientific evidence supports the fact that weight and BMI is not the answer for health promotion. We've got to stop believing that it is. But see, here's the hard part. You're going to have to be strong enough, smart enough, courageous enough to believe this, even when nobody else around you does. Hopefully, that will change in the future, but that's not where we are now. That is not the mainstream sentiment in healthcare. And I realize it's hard to think about giving up weighing yourself, hanging your hat on your BMI, focusing on intentional weight loss. I realize that is like taking away the blankie from a little kid. It has no purpose. So I had one. I carried around a little yellow blankie when I was a little kid and rubbed the, what's it called? The binding on the side. There is no purpose to it. No purpose. But we hang on to that. We clutch onto that so tightly because it's secure. We've always had it. We don't remember not having it, and we just can't let go. But this is the time to stand up for yourself. I'm gonna do a whole nother podcast, like I said, on weight stigma in the doctor's office, in the healthcare system, and how to advocate for yourself and what questions to ask your doctor. You keep listening because that's coming up. But what I want you to understand today is that there's a possibility of health at every size. And like I said, that's actually a branded term now. There's an outstanding book written by Dr. Linda Bacon. It's something you need to understand is that there are unhealthy fat people. There are also unhealthy thin people. There's also healthy thin people. There's also healthy fat people. The bottom line is that, the way I like to say it is that, health at every size has to be paired immediately with the, what's it called? I can't think of the word, but the reverse of that there's also unhealth at every size. Really, it comes down to the fact that your weight and your health are not related to each other. So we need to really start focusing on the health because that's what we care about. And if you continue to focus on weight under the guise of health, you're totally missing the mark. That's not how it works. So the takeaway here is that you can continue to believe in diet culture and participate. I believe in autonomy, and if that is you're not ready to let go of your yellow blankie, that's your choice. But you will be committed to this fat-phobic, weight-centered, unscientific way of thinking, and you will feel anxiety every time you get on the scale, and your self-worth will be tied to a 200-year-old math formula. You can live in a constant state of fear of weight gain and erode your quality of life and let your personal values be infiltrated, by these businesses that are selling you futile efforts to shrink your body. Yeah, that's your choice if you want to do that. But the other choice is you can just stop believing it. You can look to the evidence and listen to the people that have really broken this down, and you can just stop believing that your weight defines you, and your weight really isn't correlated or a measure of health. It's just a measure, and that doesn't mean anything. But you're going to need guidance. You're going to need a group to support you, because like I said, this is not mainstream thinking. You are probably unlikely to just randomly pick a personal trainer, nutritionist, dietitian, doctor, therapist off of a list and have them be open and believe this. That's disappointing to me as a scientist, but that's the honest truth. You have to, hunt in the haystack for the needle. And the needle is people like me and the other professionals that are trying to find the truth and deliver it to people like you so that we can all thrive outside of the setting of diet culture. So it's important you find your people, that you find your community to teach you, lead you, and support you through this transformation. Diet culture thinking thrives on this isolation and these assumptions that, all this is true and we are the only people having any hesitation or thoughts, and we need to just fall into line with their belief system, the really unsubstantiated belief system. But if you bring these curiosities and conversations into the light and into the communities that you become a part of, the thoughts lose power over us. And you don't need to worry about what the diet industry says anymore, because you know what to do. All right. If you're interested, I have a membership community that we set goals just like this. We have daily support in our closed private membership group with interactive coaching. I send out weekly, worksheets and articles and recipes and motivational, sort of thought work and lots of things to help people through this transformation and show up all the time, because you have to keep it's like anything, you got to practice these changes in your mind. We have a monthly coaching call that we talk through in real time some of these issues, and there's some other things that are really fun in my community group. I have a giving back program where the members get to pick the charitable contribution of the quarter and all this sort of stuff. But I'll put all those notes in the show notes and link to my website. But I really want you to consider finding your people. And if that's not with me, that's fine. But search out somebody who is really speaking the truth and standing up against the diet culture, the fat phobia, the weight stigmatization, and start to understand that there's a life off of the scale. Okay? I appreciate you listening. I know this was a super dense, very heavy, kind of detailed episode, but that history part has to be investigated and understood so that we can have an unobstructed view of where we're going, how we got here, and where we have the possibility of stepping away from that and moving forward in another direction. I appreciate you being here, and I hope you'll return next time to learn more about the truth of the non-diet way of eating. All right, until next time. Thank you so much for being here today. If you love what you've learned, follow me on social media at Maggie Landes MD, and you'll never miss a thing. You can also check out my website at maggielandesmd.com and sign up to be part of our community of eaters. Thanks again for stopping by. We'll talk again soon.